Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. Farhad, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'd love to invite you to share your story. Where'd you come from and how'd you get into this great work that you're doing now with the Chorus Foundation?
Sure thing. So, I think for me, and maybe this is true with a lot of people, no matter what they're doing, like a lot of stuff for me starts with family. I'm Iranian American. My dad is from Iran. My mom is not Cuban by blood, but grew up in Cuba. So, I grew up in a family that had these dual refugee stories from the respective revolutions of both those countries, talked a lot of politics growing up. And, my language, not necessarily my parents, a lot of the politics were sort of, explicitly anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. Because as you might imagine, my parents had feelings about, U.S. foreign policy and how it contributed to the circumstances in the respective countries that they grew up in. But I think it's worth noting that we didn't really talk about class or capitalism very much. We were in a family where, my dad was and still is a really successful entrepreneur. And we've had a kind of complicated story in terms of when we were doing well and when we weren't. But that wasn't as examined as much. And I think the other kind of dynamic in there was, growing up in a mixed race household, having a lot of identity confusion. On the one hand, growing up in the 80s in the US, Iranian American, there were a lot of implications to that. Things like the Muslim ban now, that's not new stuff for our family. There were all sorts of visa waiver things before, various kinds of anything from kids making jokes at school to my dad getting death threats and stuff when we were growing up. So that had one kind of frame, but then also when we would hang out with families that were 100% Persian, both sides of the family, they'd be speaking Farsi at home and eating food and celebrating holidays that I didn't even know about. And so I think the kind of takeaway from that, and this is true, I think, of a lot of mixed race folks, of sort of being able to code switch and bridge build between different spaces, because if I never really feel like I fit in 100%, there's that desire to bring in the part of me that's not in the room and share that and bridge to that with folks. Mm. And so, for me, where does a kind of socially alienated kid who has some seed of left-leaning politics go? And that's to punk, right? Went to a lot of shows, played in a lot of bands after, graduated from college, opened a recording studio for a while. But through this whole process, in addition to the music and sort of the cultural context of it, was also being connected to a lot of broader leftist politics. So now was being introduced to some critiques of wealth and class. And of course, any good teenager, bringing that home to my parents and haranguing them with it and being why don't we do this? Or why do we do that? Or why is it like this? But the net outcome of it was promising myself that given that, we were like a family where like I was donor class. I had been gifted a significant amount of money by my dad when I was still in my teens, really, that I needed to start some sort of wealth redistribution project. And I told myself I'd do it before I turned 30. And I I think I beat that deadline by a couple of years or something like that. So that's how I ended up with a foundation that I was running. And I made a few decisions, wanted to focus on the climate crisis, but kind of approached it like, I don't even know what that means. And I don't know how compatible that is with the politics that I've developed in these other spaces. But that I personally wanted to be directly involved in the daily work of the foundation. This wasn't like a, like a living donor seeds something and like kind of walks away and lets it run itself. But I considered it, for lack of a better way of putting it, like it's the Spider-Man thing. With great power comes great responsibility. And so I felt like this needed to be taken seriously, like a job, that I needed to understand where and why these resources needed to move, rather than just, being like, oh, I can pay somebody else to do that. And so that's where the Chorus Foundation came from. And we've gone through a whole journey that I imagine we'll talk about since then, because that was about 11 or 12 years ago that the foundation was set up.
Wow. Thank you. I'm curious about the attraction to the punk culture, and what was the essence or the elements of that? Like, what did you get out of that period of time?
It was, so I think what attracted me to it was, there was just a certain aesthetic attraction, right? Like I liked noisy, challenging music in the same way that I liked, sort of visually challenging paintings or like movies that had either stories or filmic aspects to them that would it wasn't just like, oh, I'm just going to digest this, but like, whoa, like, am I taking this in right? Like, if this is making me feel weird, is that something that I should like, it's going to be like a tension release thing that I'm going to like? But I also think that, especially as I started to play in bands more, really realized there's like this whole community building aspect that can exist in art scenes, and like do it yourself and punk art scenes, whether it's around the music or whether it's around, other sort of manifestations of it. It just has like a really strong sense. And I think that's what sort of kept me there, even as my musical taste branched out to other things, is this really strong sense of like being in community with each other, and like the balance of like, it's very celebratory, but it's also like work. It's like holding each other accountable and making sure folks take responsibility for the community, and like making tough decisions about, what do you do when somebody isn't being accountable to the community? So I think, even after my sort of taste in art was much broader, that sense of community was still really important to me. And I think still influences the way I think of a lot of community organizing stuff, in terms of like, that was my earliest taste of community building and maintenance.
Wow, very cool. And so what year did you start the Chorus Foundation?
2006. So I guess that's 11 years ago.
Okay. Wow. And yeah, maybe introduce more of, the mission, the purpose, what you've been up to.
Sure thing. So as I mentioned, we started out, and where we is like, me, small board, small staff, started out knowing we wanted to support work that was effectively responding to the climate crisis, but we didn't pretend that we knew what that looked like. So we were in this initial period where we were looking a lot to our peers in philanthropy to see what they were doing. And to be honest, like a lot of it ended up being stuff that had really mixed results. And that might be putting it generously, sort of purely market-driven energy efficiency efforts, sort of just individual consumer patterns, like change your light bulbs, ride your bike. But neither of those really had like a lens around power, or like where and why markets fail, or like, how do you build something up from the bottom up? It was all just like, interact with capitalism intentionally, and, it'll steer us out of this mess. And the small amount of work with a very large amount of money going into it around policy was all, very top-down federal advocacy organizations.
Right.
And, we don't have lasting federal climate policy. A lot of these, aggregated energy efficiency projects didn't really pan out. And, clearly, we need to think about politics and power, not just like being different consumers. So it was pretty early in this period where we were starting to identify, I guess, our fellow skeptics in the climate funding world, that folks suggested like, y'all should spend some time in communities that are directly impacted by either natural resource extraction, such as places like Eastern Kentucky, or, early climate impacts, like the Gulf Coast. Actually, the Gulf Coast gets impacted by everything, right? They've got the extraction impacts and the storms and the sea level rise and everything going on. So we started to spend a lot of time traveling to visit communities like that, spending time with organizers in those communities, getting to know them and their community and their work, started funding some of those organizations as well. And we really learned three things, which each of these can be like, we could do like a whole podcast on each of them, but social change requires social movements, systemic problems require systemic solutions, and that place is where these things come together, so that this isn't just about experts weighing in on the science of climate, but it's about people who are on the front lines, like building their power to intervene in their own self-interest, that it isn't just about energy systems, but it's about how does the climate interact with our economy, interact with our democracy? How are we seeing crises unfold in all three that have some of the same root causes? And this is what, also brought us to really resonate with this frame, just transition, that a lot of these new grantees that we were starting to support were using, which is, basically the succinct way of putting it is like, transition is inevitable, but justice is not. That we always see change, especially in how our economy works and how our technology works. But historically, there's certain communities that have always gotten, thrown under the bus. And if you're getting thrown under the bus, it doesn't matter if it's solar powered or not, by these kinds of transitions. And so, learning a lot from folks like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth and the kind of organizing that they were doing in Eastern Kentucky, which, was about environmental justice, but it was also about economic justice, right? And that you can't just say we need to shut down the coal industry and have the main economic driver for that region just totally disappear. All this stuff obviously being very relevant with a lot of the conversations that people have had running up to and post the most recent election about regions of this country that have experienced some form of economic atrophy or collapse, and the fact that like a lot of folks, not the folks we work with, but a lot of folks have just been ignoring that. And it's something that we need to take very, very seriously, because there's other parts of the country that are headed for similar transitions that might also be unjust transitions. So that's how we kind of ended up in this space around supporting local work that was like multi-issue, that's connecting multiple strategies and multiple campaign objectives. And again, there's a lot that could be said about this, but the thing that's most important to us is that we provide long-term general operating support to these kinds of organizations. So as a funder, we're not like, here's a grant, talk to us in a year and we'll see if you hit all your benchmarks, and then we'll give you another one. We basically said to these organizations, like, we're a spend out foundation, we're only gonna be around 10 years. We're gonna fund you every year of those 10 years. And then we can spend the time talking to each other about different things, like who can we introduce you to? Are there things that you want to hear from us that we might have seen in other places? Do you want us to convene and facilitate meetings? Do you want us to help you strategize around fundraising? There's like so many things we can do to try to be helpful and follow the leadership of these folks on the ground, in addition to just cutting checks. And so we wanted to like get the commitment to cutting checks like out of the way and say, we're there, we're with you. It doesn't matter if there's an executive director change or if your campaigns have to shift over time or whatever, that we're buying into your leadership in terms of what needs to happen in those communities. And so that's like a really big part of how we operate.
Wow. This is somewhat unique, huh? To what we're seeing in philanthropy at large. Oh yeah.
We hear our grantees aren't shy about telling us what some of their other funders do.
Do you feel like you have any peers in terms of your approach?
Yeah, totally.
One thing, and I guess I just wanted to underline one thing I read in your materials, that you're passionate about pursuing this question of how philanthropy might play a role in putting itself out of business.
Yeah.
I think this is parallel to what you're talking about sunsetting. So I'd really like to hear more about that.
Well, conveniently enough, there's an answer to actually both questions you just asked. One of the our peers in philanthropy who's been really, really inspiring to us is Fund for Democratic Communities, who we feel like are doing a really great job of demonstrating what it looks like for, folks who exist in philanthropy as it's conventionally defined, right? Like they have some capital that's been, to be honest, extracted and consolidated and enclosed and put under the control of a small number of people. And they're trying to put that capital back under community control, both through grants and investments. And I think we've just learned so much from them about how to think of the investment side of things. And as I'm sure most folks in philanthropy around the investment side, it's this sort of, you get to do good and make money at the same time sort of frame, but it's more like the leading edge of it for so long has been, oh, how do you align your investments to the same mission statement as your grants, which is great. Don't get me wrong. For a long time, people weren't even doing that. And so you had folks.
Well, they're mostly still not doing
Yeah. But even the conversation wasn't happening. But I mean, we think to really do it, you have to align them to the same strategy, right? How can we be making investments in the same communities where we're doing grant making? Because otherwise, even with the leading edge being, divest from coal, invest in renewables. Well, if you're divesting from coal, you're divesting from, Central Appalachia, Powder River Basin, et cetera, places that may not see other forms of economic development other than natural resource extraction. And then you're investing in, some, I'm sure, perfectly brilliant clean tech entrepreneur who's in the Bay Area or something like that. That's a regressive movement of capital in the sense that you're pulling it out of communities that see really no investment. And then you're putting it into a community that sees a lot of investment, although maybe in particular sectors. And so Fund for Democratic Communities and some of the work that they're doing right now with Working World and Movement Generation around the Reinvest in Our Power project and the Reinvest Network, I think has been really exciting work for us to get to know and to support, because it's really at that, the tip of the spear in terms of how do you support work that's aligning the political organizing with the politicized economic development, in the same counties, in the same cities, in the same places, which of course is complicated, right? Because the investment opportunities don't always exist. You have to think about how you deploy grant dollars to create the pipeline for things that you can later invest in. But to take it back to the putting philanthropy out of business part, the thing that resonates really powerfully for me is this question of why should the return on investment come back to us? Why should the return on investment stay within the investor class as opposed to putting the capital into community controlled investment vehicles, such as the kind of financial cooperatives that Working World and other folks are building, and then stay there? So that instead of us doing a loan in Central Appalachia and then we get a return on investment and then we make another loan in Central Appalachia and it's me making decisions from here in New York City, it's just upfront saying, here's some money, we'll just grant it to a local community-controlled financial cooperative. And then that's the end of our having a role in terms of where that money goes, but that's the beginning of the community having direct control and being able to make the kinds of, locally accountable and, taking into account local expertise as well as accountability, the kinds of investments that really need to have. Because that's what we aspire to do, both on the grant making and investment side, but we're not from these communities, and we travel there as much as we can and try to learn about as much as what's going on. But at the end of the day, I see us as being in the way. And so we are part of the grant making we do is how do we fund structures that will help us get out of the way so that the next time somebody's sitting on a pile of capital like we were, they're less likely to say, oh, let's start a foundation and let's be really radical and really accountable and really relationship-based and all these things that are really good, but they can say, oh, these community-controlled financial institutions exist. Let's just hand over some of this money to them. Maybe we don't need to build our own institution and try to design all these processes and structures to be accountable, investors or accountable donors, and we can let the communities do that for themselves. So by funding work that's building those opportunities, I feel like even by baby steps, we're helping show what it looks like to build new models of community-controlled capital that, if you play this out over time, would hopefully relieve the need of some outside, grant maker or investor like us, and would also be addressing those basic inequities that cause the resources to be extracted and consolidated and enclosed and put, under the control of people like us to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Why is philanthropy necessary in the first place?
Yeah, it's a pressure release valve to a system that, Some folks call it broken, and I call it, it works very, very well, just, for a very small number of people.
Right. So yeah, I love this idea of if we're really looking, for an altruistic outcome, for a future that works for everybody, thinking about the ability for humanity to continue to inhabit the planet. If we're really serious about that, then investments that profit people who already have enough money to invest isn't going to get us there.
That's right. And I think I want to give a lot of credit to the kinds of political education tools that our grantees use. Specifically like movement generation has a great, what are the pillars of the economy? What do they look like in an extractive, exploitative economy? What might those same pillars look like in a regenerative, just economy? And going through one of those trainings one time, it's like, well, so what does philanthropy look like in the regenerative, just economy? And just being like, oh, it wouldn't be there. You wouldn't have it. And another world is possible. We believe that. That's why we think long-term work requires long-term vision, not just pragmatism and little steps. I mean, the pragmatism and little steps, as long as they're getting you to that long-term vision. But we really believe in the long-term vision of what is a world that no longer has philanthropy, both because it can't have it and because it doesn't need it anymore. Now, it's going to be a while until some of our larger siblings in philanthropy take this kind of stuff seriously, but we kind of view our role over the next 7 years that we have in our spend out to demonstrate what it looks like to just move assets back under community control and then be done with the project of having a foundation.
I want to ask a question just that might come from, a peer of yours in the foundation world. And they would, aren't you scared? What happens to you in your life and your identity? And why would you give away all your money? What? That's so crazy.
Well, there's a lot of potential scary things around this story, right? And I think, one of the ones that's really scary is just the urgency of a lot of these issues. I mean, that certainly comes up a lot around climate. And so not intervening around climate is really scary. And that's, one of the first folks that I met who was really advocating for spending down was John Hunting from the Belden Fund. And it was, really emphasizing the environmental need that $1 granted now is going to be more effective than $1.25 granted somewhere down the road. And so that's really scary to me. But also and I think about this a lot when I talk to other donors, there's plenty of people in my life who never had the option of having this money, right? And they're doing, pretty well. There's challenges they have that I don't have, but they're all living healthy, wonderful lives. And so I'd rather fight for a system that provides what's needed for those folks and count myself among them in as much as you can, because the class dynamic never goes away, right? If all the money disappeared tomorrow, I would still have a tremendous amount of privilege in terms of family, in terms of education, in terms of the way I've been socialized and all these kinds of things. But the one thing I can control is how much am I setting aside for myself in a bank account? And I feel pretty strongly that I shouldn't be comparing myself to other folks in the donor class to think about how much I should be setting aside. I should be comparing myself to, for lack of a better way putting it, the 99%, and in terms of what people have available to them to think of their futures and things like that. And if that doesn't seem like enough, well, then that's what all this political organizing is fighting for, right? Is to build those kinds of social safety nets and that kind of wealth staying into community and things like that. So, plenty of people have said, oh, but when you're older, when you have kids, all these things, you'll feel differently. And that may be, but when I was in my teens, people told me I'd feel differently when I got out of college. When I got out of college, they told me I'd feel differently when I was in my 30s. Now that I'm in my late 30s, they're like, oh, you're going to feel differently when you're in your 40s or 50s. So it hasn't happened yet.
Have you gotten any impassioned pleas to abandon this reckless course that you're on?
No, I haven't. I find, certainly everybody within family is super supportive. I mentioned earlier that, I like to have challenging political conversations with my parents because partially they like it too, that's sort of the culture in our family. My mom one time was joking with my sister and I and saying our number one hope was that we were going to raise two critical thinkers. And unfortunately that's what we've done. And y'all are just critically thinking about everything that your father and I do. But, in terms of interacting with other folks in in sort of donor class, investor class, owning class spaces, I think a lot of folks are interested. They're not sure if it's a limb that they can personally step out on, but I think it's most of the reaction that I've felt personally. So there's a risk I'm projecting this on other folks, but what I perceive in other folks is there's actually something liberating about saying, like, you know what, I don't need to worry about maintaining this. I don't need to worry about having like this fiscal responsibility to this capital that's been put under my stewardship. I can say, you know what, I want to give it all away, like literally all of it or really close to all of it. And that's fine because I'm going to be okay. Like, I think there's something really liberating to that, but it is busting through for some people, that anxiety of like, oh my God, but how much is okay? And it's like, oh, how much is okay for most people in the world? It's a pretty small amount. I
want to appreciate your leadership and bravery in terms of pushing forward.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you predict, this, you might be influential in this way in terms of convincing more people? You mentioned Fund for Democratic Communities, which we just had Ed Whitfield on the podcast.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I really appreciate their work. Is there a growing movement here, or are you guys still like outliers way ahead of it?
I think there's something growing. We've been really excited to work more with folks, like Ed and Marnie from Fund for Democratic Communities, folks from Solutions Project, on some of these pieces have worked historically with like folks from Solidago Foundation or New World Foundation. Like, we have a number of allies within philanthropy that we've been working together for a while. And we've really, I think in recent years, taken it really seriously. Like, not just like, how do we sit at the back of the room at a mainstream funder conference with our arms crossed being grumpy together, but like, what does it look like to take our own political education seriously? What does it look like to spend the time really developing ideological analysis and really smart strategies together? And a lot of what we talk about is how do we organize our peers? We've got our work cut out for us, but I think, especially for me, at least within the last 6 years, have seen a lot of openness to conversations in philanthropy. And I think a lot of this has to do with the level of social movement activity that we've seen in the United States. And particularly, I think, Occupy Wall Street, because of the analysis around wealth and financial inequity, that we've had a lot of conversations within philanthropy that we like never could have had before. Some of those conversations actually lead to, some of our peers shifting their grant making strategies, making decisions around spending out, making decisions about not just the what they fund, but the how they fund it. And so that's been really exciting. And, if you talk about the resources we represent, we're just a drop in the bucket of philanthropy overall. And philanthropy overall is just a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall economy. But nonetheless, it does feel like things have really started to loosen and move. And so that's like, when we think about next steps for us, it's like a lot of it is how do we organize our peers? How can we create containers for, leadership development and political education for people within philanthropy to approach things in different and hopefully much more transformational ways?
Do you have a vision of, at the end of your, when you sunset, do you feel like you'll have a vision of what you've accomplished, or?
Yeah, I mean, so we have 4 communities that we've made these long-term commitments to. It's Eastern Kentucky, Alaska, and then Buffalo, New York, and Richmond, California. Wow. And so 2/3 of our grant making every year goes to those 4 communities. And then the rest goes to some other place-based work, but then a lot of national, like capacity building organizations or networks or trainers or political educators. And for those 4 geographies where we provide the long-term funding, part of it is we're really looking to like, what are their goals for, this 10-year interval? And we try to, spend more time listening to what they think they might be able to do and what they'll need to do it, and then trying to be helpful and supporting them along that path than we do coming in with, some folks in philanthropy would say, we're going to pick 4 locations where we think it's likely that we'll see a certain kind of policy that we've already decided is the right one get implemented. And we're just very different from that. I mean, our grantees are very concerned about policy victories, but they each might have a slightly different version of that they're pursuing at their local level. But I think the number one thing that we know that we want to see, and this is both stuff that we started to think about and that started to emerge from work that our grantees were doing, is the creation and support of these community-controlled financial institutions. So our grantees, through their work with Working World and connecting with Ed and Marnie at F4DC, connecting with folks at Movement Generation and a bunch of other groups, have been thinking about building these community-controlled investment vehicles, these cooperative financial institutions that can then invest in worker cooperatives and have all this amazing stuff going on the way that the folks at the Working World and others have been doing it for a while now. Those are very new for our grantees. And so we're hoping by the time we've spent out that those are healthy and proven and have even more resources going into them, and hoping that our early grant making and investment support is part of what paves the way for that, for our peers in philanthropy to see why these are important financial structures, why resources should be moved to them, both investments and grants. So that's like a really big part of it. And that really came from our grantees. And then what has sort of come from our side is the desire to just pose the question to our grantees and see how much progress we can make in answering it. Like, what does the equivalent around grant making look like? And again, this will be different in each geography. I mean, we already have some level of democratized decision making in some of those geographies. In some places, our grantees have been clear with us, like, listen, we'll help you frame things. We'll help you think about who should get like a request for concept papers, and we'll give you our feedback on the concept papers you get, but we don't want to be part of decision making at all. Right? Because we don't want to be perceived as gatekeepers or anything like that. And some of our other grantees in other places have said, like, you know what, can we just give you a slate? Can we just tell you everybody you should fund here, because we know we're in relationship with them and we feel confident that we can give you an answer that's going to feel good for everybody on the ground. And we're open to either approach, but we're curious about what it looks like to get more to that second approach in more geographies, where we can say, here's support for y'all to build whatever kind of decision-making and accountability you need for some sort of intermediary. And then we'll just put the money in it and y'all can get that money to where it needs to go. And then we can spend our time advocating to our peers to put money in things like that. So if we can see some growth, both on the grant-making side and the investment side of these community-controlled financial institutions, which, again, we could spend a whole podcast talking about how they're different from existing community foundations or CDFIs. That's what we'd really like to support our grantees in building, because that feels like a good handoff once we're no longer around. It just puts them in a better position, having more capital under their control and having these ways of presenting themselves as decision makers around philanthropic capital they'll still be needing to fundraise.
So the idea with these would be like a revolving loan fund. The money would go out to one group, and as it comes out, then there's the capital go out to another group. If there's profits or dividends, then that would fund some grant making. Yeah,
and deeply democratically governed. So, folks who have gotten these kinds of loans being pulled into governance roles and decision making. So it's a cooperatively governed revolving loan fund.
Yeah, I just was chatting with folks from the Ujima project. In Boston. So apparently, I don't think they have a large amount of capital under control, but there's some money, and there's this model, right, of different stakeholders, voting or helping control where that money goes. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're thinking about it in terms of like a participatory budgeting kind of model, if I remember correctly, which I think is part of what makes it different from like a community foundation. Community foundations are, there's a full spectrum of them, right? Some of them are amazingly progressive and radical in how they operate, but a lot of them, they look like a normal foundation. You've got program officers who, are wonderful people, but have very powerful, complicated jobs. And they've got a bunch of donors that put money into the community foundation who have a lot of political opinions about where they want their money to go and everything. And it doesn't necessarily end up having that kind of deep democracy that a more of a participatory budgeting sort of philosophical approach, regardless of what it looks like logistically, to moving the resources. So yeah, folks like Ujima Project, like that's the kind of stuff like that we want to be betting on right now in the communities that we support, that they'll figure out how to build some of these things out and demonstrate that they can, that they can take in larger pieces of capital and know exactly what to do with them.
I'm curious to hear more about your the hotspots. How did you choose the hotspots, and then maybe we could hear some of some of the solutions that are coming out of maybe one of them, if you want to pick one to dive into a little deeper.
Yeah. So it was a little asynchronous because we arrived on the support in Kentucky a couple years earlier than the other three. Really just, I think, the coincidence of where we developed relationships first. It was one of the first communities that our sort of our little cynics club within philanthropy suggested that, we should really go down there and see what they were doing. And we were just blown away because the kind of work that they were doing, and, this was 7 or 8 years ago. So this is, everybody says like, oh, the future of coal, like, everybody but the president understands what the future of coal is right now. Like 7 years ago, that wasn't the case. The writing was on the wall, but not everybody was reading it the same way.
Right.
And so we were really blown away in that kind of really complicated political and economic environment, the ways in which they were tying together the organizing and the economic development and like the cultural piece too, the cultural shift as well. They were having more success around energy efficiency programs than people in Cambridge, Massachusetts were, right? So like the People's Republic of Cambridge was not doing as good a job convincing people to do energy retrofits as folks were in the hollers of Eastern Kentucky. So that really stood out to us and, started funding Kentuckians for the Commonwealth and Mountain Association for Community Economic Development and a number of other organizations. But those were sort of our biggest grantees. And so when we at a board level made a decision to spend out, we decided two things. One, we already knew we were going to fund KFTC and MESED every year that we were around. So that's when we made those 10-year commitments to them. But we also knew we wanted to identify, we thought like 1 or 2, and it ended up being 3 other geographies for a similar level of commitment. So we made the commitment to Kentucky. And then we started what was like about a year-long process. And we tried to make it very light on the applicants, where we asked around, like, who's doing this kind of just transition work that's really about vision and about transforming the way political economy works, that's in a specific place or in a specific kind of, even if it's geographically distributed, like specific sector. And that's about a group of organizations working together. So we had like about 40 maybe or more different constellations of groups suggested to us. We asked all of them to send us like quick little concept papers. Wow. We got 20 some, about half of that were ones that we moved forward with. And really they're all good work, right? Like this is us starting to make these hard decisions of what to select. And then of the 9 that we had deeper conversations with, we landed on 3, which was Kentucky, Alaska, Richmond, California, Buffalo, New York. The reason those 4 total, with the 3 new ones, part of it is diversity, right? So diversity of geography, diversity of demographics or identity groups in terms of the leadership of the organizations, as well as the base that are organizing, urban and rural, a diversity of like which national networks they were part of, because we wanted to sort of have an interesting mix of like folks who were connected to Climate Justice Alliance, folks who were connected to then National People's Action before they merged in with some of the other organizing networks. And also like diversity in terms of like folks we knew well and folks we didn't know as well. So, the folks in Richmond, California, like Kentucky, we'd been funding for a few years. It wasn't really probably a surprise to anybody that we were considering them in this process. We'd never been to Buffalo before. We'd never connected with our now grantees there. And each of these geographies was doing multiple things well and a couple of things like really well in ways that we knew would be inspiring to other grantees, because we already knew part of this is going to be like, how do we help them connect with each other, either by supporting the networks they're already part of or by seeing like, is it useful for us to convene folks? And so like with Kentucky, it was the first place that we learned about that partnership between organizing and economic development, but just like the way they articulated the vision, like a real kind of value statement, not like a vision, like here's a document that just stays that way, but like a moving, breathing way of approaching things. And we could really see the way that folks from other organizers from other geographies would like light up when they heard the folks from Kentucky talking about it, because it was plain language that anybody would understand, but was really transformational. The folks in Richmond, some of the way that they approach the political work. And so we have a C4, like, I don't know what you call it, like affiliated action fund for the foundation. So we do C4 work as well. And just the fact that in Richmond, they have with all the money that Chevron puts into elections in Richmond as a company town with a giant refinery, that they not only started winning those elections, but Chevron actually stopped putting money in because I think they're just sort of like, okay, we need to step back because we don't even know how to fight y'all anymore. And relationships to statewide, electoral organizing as well. In Buffalo, I think the economic development of the Green Development Zone that Push Buffalo and Massachusetts Avenue Project and others have been involved in, just like really seeing locally what a local living economy looks like, that there's previously vacant homes that are now being renovated to be high efficiency, affordable homes by people from that community. I mean, you have folks just returning from being incarcerated, getting jobs and getting job training and career development to like build affordable housing in their own community. And then like similar structures around urban food systems. Like that's something that really was exciting for folks. And then in Alaska, I think the cultural piece in terms of, a lot of the work we support there is Alaska Native led, and their sense of what transforming the economy looks like is grounded in these really amazing history of subsistence economies and relationships to natural lifeways and things like that, that like the way they talk about the economy that they want to live in, it's just, they can talk about it so much more freely because they were never doing it the way the rest of us were, except for the ways in which colonialism tried to enforce that on them. And so each of these four places, like they bring something to the table where when we convene them, we've just seen how excited they get about hearing from each other because they all have these interesting things that they do really well. They all have these different campaigns that they've won. We're just so happy that we got to meet all of them and have the opportunity to support their work.
Wow, Farhad, this is just, it's a deluge of solutions and inspirations. so refreshing to hear, it's not just one little project that's kind of leading the way forward. I just want to really acknowledge and appreciate the wholeness of not only your thinking, the depths of your thinking, but also the way you're implementing the solutions, modeling not only what other foundations could do in the future, but also thinking really deeply about how well you can spend down the foundations, empowering communities to develop their own funds. It's a really beautiful story. So.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I want to, I always try to give our grantees so much credit for showing us what's possible and showing us the way. I mean, when we first started visiting folks, a lot of what we heard is like, listen, we're organizers. We know how to win campaigns. We stopped that coal-fired power plant, or we won this change in the tax policy. But what folks were really starting to do was like, how do we tie our ability to win things together into something that's bigger than all those victories and is actually about like, what is the world that we want to live in? And then we figure out, okay, what are the things we need to win to get there? And so that, we were and are really eager students when it comes to listening to our grantees talk about how they're thinking about that kind of stuff. Which
again, to me, just models the economy that we want in the future that's interactive, co-creative, right? We're learning from each other and maybe being surprised along the way instead of setting out to achieve a predetermined outcome.
That's right. No, that absolutely resonates.
Thanks so much. A last question for you is how can our listeners help what you're up to?
Well, we're certainly looking for good models on what democratizing grant making or investment processes look like. So I've mentioned a few of the examples of the folks that we're already in conversation with, especially on the investment side, folks like Working World and Fund for Democratic Communities. But like there are some amazingly progressive community foundations who are doing this in really amazing ways. And we'd love to connect with those folks, learn from their experiences. I think we always could stand to talk more with folks who are involved in like the funding exchange networks and other sort of, and a lot that I'm sure we've never even heard about, right? Where people have experimented with some of this, democratizing the processes and the structures and the decision-making. A lot of what we need is just more folks in the donor and investor class being willing to hand power over, which doesn't mean not being involved, but means not insisting on being the decision maker or insisting on being the one that comes up with a strategy or all these kinds of things that we just see play out all the time. I think maybe the last thing I'd say is like, we're looking for introductions to folks within philanthropy, whether it's individual donors or institutional funders who are interested in these questions and want to talk about these things, because we're very relational. I mean, I think it's all about relationships and developing real relationships with folks. That's how we try to approach things with our grantees, and that's how we try to approach things within our sector. And we could always stand to meet new folks who are outside our sort of well-trodden paths that we've been on for the past decade or more, and connect with some folks outside of that, both to be helpful where we can and to have our own horizons expanded.
Wonderful, Farhad. Let's see what our listeners can do in terms of helping the relinquishment of control and the proliferation of democracy and co-creating these solutions. So thank you so much for being with us. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Great work you're up to. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you too. This podcast is awesome. I got to go listen to all the other ones I didn't get a chance to listen to yet.
Oh, there's some good ones. All right, Farhad, we'll see you soon.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.